Is MMA in danger of failing the fans like boxing has? In MMA, there's one big fight we all want to see right now, and that's Francis Ngannou versus Jon Jones. But what's the likelihood of us ever seeing that happen? Francis Ngannou is 37 years old and has the world at his feet right now. He's got equity stake in the PFL. He's going to be the head of PFL Africa when it launches. He's got a great partner with the PFL. I can't see him going anywhere anytime soon. And PFL would gladly allow him to fight anyone. He's got freedom there to fight within mixed martial arts and within boxing. But Jones does not have the same leniency. In years gone past, I think it's fair to say that whoever was the UFC champion in a weight division was, broadly speaking, likely to be the best in the world at that weight. But now, that dynamic has started to shift. Francis Ngannou left the UFC still heavyweight champion. Of course, he was stripped of that title when he left. Jones has gone on to win that vacant title, but he's now injured. So Francis never lost that championship. Yet there was someone now in the UFC, Jon Jones, the heavyweight champion, who holds that title. Now there's the saying, isn't there? To be the man, you gotta beat the man. And Ngannou was never beaten. So there's question marks over who the best heavyweight in the world is. And with Francis leaving and showing that there is perhaps some greener grass on the other side, the likes of the PFL paying their athletes more, giving them more freedom, giving them equity stakes, it's starting to look a bit more attractive outside of the UFC. UFC's had the brand name for so long. I know athletes, seasoned mixed martial artists who just want to get to the UFC. They just want to be able to say that, hey, I'm a UFC fighter. Not an MMA fighter, a UFC fighter. That's the kind of power that the brand of the UFC has. But very quickly, people like the PFL are starting to snap at their heels, being very aggressive in terms of expansion, their acquisition of talent. And if that continues, if they start to look at the big free agents and sign them, they start to harvest that talent, the dynamic of mixed martial arts could very quickly change. Now, as I said earlier, for a long time, being the UFC champion, a lot of people would consider you the best in the world at that weight division. But now Ngannou's gone. It's tricky to argue that without finding out, without having Ngannou versus Jones, or Ngannou versus whoever the heavyweight champ is at that time. And if other athletes see this happening, see how Francis has done, and start to consider that, could we see more top-level athletes leave the UFC for the potentially greener pastures of the likes of the PFL, perhaps the likes of one championship? And then how does that change how we perceive who the best in the world is? When we've got multiple athletes who could have a stake to that claim, how do we decide who the best is? This is the problem that boxing has had for so long. There are so many organizations, the WBC, the IBF, the WBA, there's so many of them, all claiming championships, all claiming titles. And it comes down to business. Whenever their belt is defended, they get a percentage of the revenue. They get a big payday. It's a business thing. So, for so long, we've had these arguments, haven't we, about who the best in the world is in heavyweight boxing or in any boxing category. And until someone is truly undisputed, we don't know. The UFC's had a monopoly for years. If you want to prove yourself, you go to the UFC. But what's going to happen over the next 3 to 5 years as companies like the PFL continue to push forward to be aggressive in the acquisition of talent and the expansion of their brand? The athletes then start to see that and go, hang on a minute, perhaps I haven't got to be here to be recognised as the best in the world. I can make more money over there, have more freedom, have more control. And then we start to see an exodus of sorts from the UFC, which then dilutes their talent pool, which then makes it harder to point at their champions and go, yeah, you're the best, because we see top tier talent moving somewhere else, like one championship, like PFL. Then we're going to be left in limbo as to who is the best. Francis Ngannou, Jon Jones will lose the ability to single out an athlete who is the best. We'll just have more debate, more argument about who we think is. We'll never really find out. And that is a real, real shame. Until now, the UFC has provided us with an answer, or at least an answer that many of us could agree on. Yeah, sure, Bellator, PFL won, but really, if we're honest with ourselves, the majority of the time, that UFC champion, that's the best in the world. How's that going to change over the next 3 to 5 years? But this is the conundrum we've had for so long in boxing. Have an undisputed champion, a champion that holds all the belts, a champion with whom there's no question that they are, in that moment, the best. And those fights are so hard to make. There's so many politics that go into it. This is why Tyson Fury versus Alexander Usyk is a big deal. It's the first time in nearly 24 years that undisputed heavyweight champion will be crowned. To be undisputed, you've got to hold the 4 major titles. Right now, Usyk holds 3, Tyson holds 1. But even now, we have this undisputed fight. We hope. I'm hearing it's in February. But after Fury's performance against Ngannou, and although Fury got the nod, it's a win on his record, there are so many people across the community who are giving Francis his flowers and saying that he beat him. That's debatable. That's a conversation for another time. But what isn't a conversation, what isn't debatable, is that it certainly weakened Tyson Fury's stance at the top of the heavyweight division. So him going into the undisputed fight with Usyk, let's just say Tyson does win. There's always a little question mark, a little asterisk there about Ngannou. And I don't know about you, if Fury's got all the belts, I'd want to see him versus Ngannou for the belts this time. So how do we solve this? How do we solve this problem within mixed martial arts? An option is to have an overarching MMA organization or a body that has a championship which it can assign competitors to, that it can assign a UFC fighter to fight a one fighter or a PFL fighter, that it can rank athletes across organizations and then deem fights to happen. That's one way of it happening. Having a belt which is recognized as the belt, which can be defended interpromotionally. Is that ever going to happen? PFL seem to be keen to play ball with interpromotion, but the UFC, man, I can't see that happening anytime soon. Could you imagine if this did exist? There was an inter-organizational world champion, and the UFC champion fought and lost, and now it's sat in one or Bellator or PFL. That takes so much power away from the UFC. Right now, the UFC have that brand recognition, and they have, again, arguably the best stable of champions in the world. But if you had a belt that is inter-organizational, inter-promotion, if it doesn't lie with the UFC, that damages UFC's brand power so much, and it helps the other organizations. So I can't ever see the UFC agreeing to something like that. So how will it work itself out? Only time will tell. Will the UFC eventually have to open and step through that forbidden door to solidify its place as the premier MMA organization? Or does MMA go the way of boxing, with multiple athletes claiming that they are the best in the world? And it's very hard, potentially within MMA, impossible to make the fights to determine who truly is the best. It's something that we as fans need to be aware of, need to keep track of. Hopefully there's a way to figure this thing out. But only time will tell.